Thank you, Sebastian. It's a real pleasure to be back in St. Louis. I think I've been here once since I ended my association with you guys. There's a button here someplace. I'll just use this for now. There was a misstatement Sebastian made. He called me a botanist. I'm an ex-botanist. All right. The time from 1990 to 2000 was some of the best years of my life. It's when I had my children, it's when they were young children. And we had this tremendous program going on in Bolivia. I had dozens of students. We put in dozens of plots. We collected tens of thousands of specimens. And then after that, I went to Washington, D.C. and worked for one of these big organizations. We call them bingos, big international non-governmental organizations. And it was interesting and stuff, but not nearly the satisfaction of working in an academic institution with people who are keen on knowledge rather than keen on marketing, which is what the bingos dedicate a lot of their time to. Although, we need them. They do stuff, and I don't regret my time with them either. This study, as soon as I left the garden, they sent me to work with this group that was doing Amazon scenarios, modeling what the Amazon would look like in the future. And we created these models, different kinds of models, economic models, spatial models, fire prediction models, way back in the early aughts, when modeling was much more simple and a guy like me could figure it out, and or at least pretend he could figure it out. And so a lot of that was summarized in this publication in 2007 called The Perfect Storm in the Amazon Wilderness. Then it focused on infrastructure and agriculture and a little bit on climate change. And then in 2015, the Moore Foundation, which financed the first publication, this is the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, asked for an update. And so they contracted me, and I started working on the second iteration. It got out of hand, and it kept growing and growing and growing. And I finished it in 2019, and nobody would publish it. It was too big. It was just literally unpublishable because it was too big. And so I scratched my head and figured out what to do, talked to some people, and decided we'd self-publish it, but not, just throw it out there on the internet, but to publish it with a real publishing house so it's indexed and edited and had, done well. And I found this publisher in Scotland, White Horse Press, and so we're publishing it in a serial format. This is actually the third iteration. The second iteration wasn't fit for publication. I actually realized that by the time I finished the last chapter, the first chapter was out of date. So we're updating each chapter, and it's coming out once every 6 months or so, one of these chapters. I'm just finishing chapter 6 at the moment. So this is the third iteration, and it's about 1,500 pages at this point in time. Big fat thing. You can use it as a doorstop. And I'll tell you how we're solving that in the last bit with this Mongabay collaboration. So let me see here. What I'm just going to do here is just go through chapter by chapter, kind of give you a broad overview of each chapter. There's just way too much information in each chapter, so I'll just kind of start with just briefly describe it, and then I'll give you 2 take-home messages from each chapter, a good one and a bad one. An optimistic one and a pessimistic one, which reflects the title of the book, Success and Failure in the Fight to Save the Amazon. And so the first chapter is an overview of the book and a bucket of cold water, because I get out there very early and say we're losing the fight to save the Amazon. All right, in spite of the efforts, in spite of the billions of dollars, it's not working, and it's not working for multiple reasons. There have been lots of successes, but there's lots of things that aren't working. And so in the first paragraph, in the first chapter, I bring this right to the fore, and you can see this graphic here of the GDP of the Amazon, the forest economy, what's known as biocommerce these days. That's that green box down there in the corner, and it's like 3% of GDP. And you're not going to save the Amazon with 3% of GDP. You have to figure out how to engage the entire economy into whatever strategy you go for. And so that's the negative message. 4% GDP of the economy is in biocommerce. The positive take-home message, particularly from this thing, is that the service economy is more than half. That's the blue boxes and the tan boxes, and you can work with the service economy, whether it be physicians, lawyers, legal, real estate. There's restaurants, etc. These people are willing to listen to a message of conservation, education, government services, health services. And so this is where we need to focus a lot of our marketing or strategies, I think, if we want to take the Amazon into a new development phase. In addition to making biocommerce grow and reforming the other sectors, like the black one is the extractive sector, so that's mining and oil and stuff like that. So that's the first chapter, and I'm going to try to go rapidly because I'm assuming you're all going to ask lots of interesting questions at the end, right? So I want to make plenty of room for that. So chapter 2 deals with roads, highways. When you talk about deforestation, they always talk about highways. There's a new road. Oh, no, there's a new deforestation front. Well, it's true. And the other issue that gets lots of attention is, dams. You build a dam, you mess with fish migration, you trap the sediments, you mess with the ecosystem services and the aquatic integrity of large aquatic ecosystems. And so the first chapter goes into that. It's very regionalized. I go into great detail on every state in the Amazon, every state in Brazil, every region of the Andes. Talk you through the history of what they did when they were built, why they were built, who's moving down them, and in the same way with the dams, which is just a whole bunch of them, and I'll get to that in a minute. There's a thing here that's different from what you see a lot in the press is there's a focus on bulk transport systems. That's rail and barges and the things that they're doing in the Amazon, obviously related to agribusiness, export soybeans and corn and things like that. So the negative take-home message here is railroads are coming to the Amazon, whether we like it or not. And there's one that's already in there. You can see this map. The pink stuff is agribusiness. The yellow stuff is pasture, and there's some brown stuff, and you know what the green stuff is. And so you can see there's this pink that's soybean cultivation and field crops, and then it's moving north. And so as you build these railroads, there's a railroad on the west, and there's another railroad that there's at the EIA stage that goes from Cuiabá to Santarém. That's down the highway BR-163, right down through the heart of the Amazon. And there's a highway there now. It was paved about 10 years ago. It was first built in the 1980s. And they're going to put a railroad there. And the soybean farmers are going with them. I was in Santarém last year, and there's probably 10,000 hectares of soybean on the Amazon River, right? Not in Mato Grosso. And they're taking their soybeans there. They're growing it up there, and so they're investing a lot in bulk transport systems. That's railways and barges. And of course, barges come with river modification, which means dams. So these things are all, in fact, kind of linked together. Let me see. Positive take-home message. That was a negative. Oh, soy. It's just not soy. All right, it's soy and maize. Because you can't grow soy alone. You have to grow maize. It's a disease thing. All right, if you try to grow soy, and they do two crops a year. If you do soy crop after crop, you don't have any soy because of the disease issues. So they do soy, maize, soy, maize, soy, maize. And that's creating enormous quantities of maize. And they don't know what to do with it. And so they now have one of the largest livestock industries in the world, feeding their maize to chickens and pigs, which is just generating enormous amounts of money. That money is being reinvested in more field crops. And now they still have enough. And last year, Iowa's largest producer of corn ethanol opened up a plant in Mato Grosso. And so now, you know, everyone thinks of Brazil and ethanol, you think of sugarcane. Well, corn will soon displace sugarcane as the primary source of ethanol in Brazil. So these things are just marching forward, and it's all about money. A positive take-home message, I always promise one, is that in the Andes particularly, investment in agroforestry systems, particularly coffee and cacao, are economically competitive with industrial crops at certain scales, all right, particularly at the small scale, the smallholder scale. And so that's good. Not just that they're better for the environment, they're economically competitive with this other stuff, which is less positive. Now let's go to the next slide. Land. Well, I talked about roads, opening up a new frontier, agriculture coming in, and of course, you know, changing land use. Typically at first goes to pastures and then crops come along later. And so this is a real estate phenomenon, rural real estate. And the economics of roads and agricultural production systems are actually manifested in land values. And the change in land values is actually more important or as important as roads and agricultural production system. Let me see if that, one instance, for instance, in Mato Grosso, right, which is the heart of the Brazilian, it's the southern part of the Amazon, the heart of the Brazilian production system. Land values have increased 3,000%, all right, since 2000. That's an annual rate of growth of 20%. That's where we all want to invest our money if you're interested in return on investment. So a lot of these cattle ranchers, they actually break even growing cows, but they all become millionaires the moment they sell their ranch to a soybean farmer. All right, and so this is all these positive feedback things that well, for instance, the amount of money that the producers are going to save by using bulk transport systems to move their soy to farm instead of paying a trucker. They have to pay a trucker about $90 a ton, you know, where the farmers here in Kansas, they pay about $20 a ton, or in Iowa, because they have railroads and barges. And so that comes to more than $1 billion a year of savings to the producers in Mato Grosso, $1 billion a year. That goes into the pockets of the farmers, all right, not to the companies, because the farmers are the ones who pay the transport. And so that's just giving them an enormous amount of money, $1 billion a year. What's the size of the Amazon fund? $1 billion. And it's invested over, and it's being spent over how many years? A decade. So that the numbers just are astounding. All right, you have to look at the numbers to understand what's going on here. So a negative take-home message with respect to land is there's this thing called the Cadastro Ambiental Rural in Brazil, and it started in about 2008 or 9 when Brazil was trying to save their supply chains. And so you had to register in this cadastro. So it's a land registry. And so all of those gray boxes, these are the land properties that have been registered in the Cadastro Ambiental Rural. And the ones in the pink ones are the ones that actually have legal title to their land. And so you can see here that there's a big problem with land titles. Nobody knows who owns what. Their land titles are fictitious, fraudulent. And so they're trying to fix it with this Cadastro Ambiental Rural, but of course people are clever. And you see in the lower one, now land grabbers, grileiros as they call them in Brazil, are using that as a means to steal more lands. So they're taking their fake properties and they're registering them in the Cadastro Ambiental Rural. And then they go to the judge, see, this is my papers, I have it, you can see them in the National Registry. And so it's a problem. And so that's the bad news. While this was all going on, the World Bank, the Brazilian government, AID, they also spent, many millions of dollars doing these ecological zoning things. They're called zonificación ecológica ambiental, or in Bolivia it was called the Plan de Uso de Suelos. It was a way to say, okay, this land's good for this. You can grow crops over here. This should be forestry. This should be ranching. But that process, which took place mainly between 1995 and 2010, and it's still going on, is what they use to create their national park systems. All right, and so that was a land use planning process. It hasn't been particularly effective in controlling where people farm, but we were able to use that to create a national park system. Mineral commodities. Well, the world needs mineral commodities, and the Amazon has them in spades. The Amazon nations are highly dependent upon them. Their macroeconomic stability is absolutely essential, particularly for countries like Ecuador, that is, maybe 40% or 50% of their export revenues come from oil. And if they don't have those revenues, they're going to have a balance of payment problems. They're not going to be able to import things they need for their economy, like, medicine. And so it's a reality. And Brazil, big mining company, some of the biggest mines in the world are in the Amazon. That's in the lower part. That's a aluminum mine in Pará, and so that's going to continue, and it's got to continue. They have nickel, copper, all these things we need for our new economy, and the industrial mines. I guess if there's a positive message, the industrial mining companies are embracing ESG investment, and which is forcing them to face their issues with respect to long-term management of tailings. Right? There's a big mine is a big ugly thing, but compared to say like a soybean industry, it's nothing in spatial area. But they leave a long-term environmental liability that's poisonous, or create a dam that wreaks havoc, as we've seen over the last several years. So the big companies are finally addressing their long-term environmental liabilities. In the negative message here, it has to do with that slide up on the top, and that's the informal gold sector. There are big industrial mines in the Amazon that go after gold, and they produce more gold than the little guys, but the little guys are all over the place, and they're just going crazy. Every single country has them. And they're completely out of control. By my estimates, there's about 450,000 of them that live in the Amazon. That's as many as the indigenous people, just to give you a comparison. Well, no, it's not. It's less than the indigenous people. But they produced $8.5 billion last year in export revenues for these countries. Bolivia, $2 billion. That's as much as Bolivia's soybean industry. So these are really important economic actors, and they are unmanageable. They do not obey the law. They don't believe the law applies to them, and they're very difficult to manage. So that's the negative take-home message there. Culture, that's the chapter I'm finishing up now. That was very educational. It's also about demographics. I just mentioned the fact that the indigenous people, there's about 2.5 million indigenous people. That's about 4% of the people who live in the Amazon. The rest are migrants or descendants from migrants, right? And they vote, and they have their own beliefs and value systems. Many of them are now, currently, there's a big increase in evangelical Christians, particularly in Brazil, and they're very conservative. A lot of them are small farmers, very engaged in economic activities that's conventional. So this chapter goes into a lot of that. I describe the history of migration in the Amazon, and each country has its own little history, very interesting. And then I map the stakeholders, which some you find one of the biggest groups causing deforestation in the Amazon are Mennonites. They've caused more than 1 million hectares of deforestation in Bolivia, where they've been active for 50 years at least. But now they're in Peru, Colombia, and Suriname. And these are large families. They have 10, 11, 12 kids, and they all have to be farmers. It's part of their religion. And so they're out there looking for land. And Ucayali, they're all over the place in Ucayali, and it's a big problem. And just last week, I saw an article in Mongabay. They're now in Suriname. It's just very terrible. This is where I deal with corruption. And I'm supposed to be telling you something good and bad, and I'm getting there we go. Negative take-home message. Bolsonaro, as our own ex-president, is a manifestation, not a cause. And so what's going on in Brazil with Bolsonaro reflects something that's going on in Brazil. And a lot of these evangelical Christians, in fact, they have they call it Boi, Biblia y Bala, all right? And that's cows, guns, and the Bible. And they have formed, each one of them is a separate interest group, but it's the largest voting bloc in Congress, in both the Senate and in the House of Deputies. And so they're very conservative, very much committed to the conventional economy, and they vote. And so that's an issue that we need to understand and develop a strategy. I mean, if you're an environmental advocate, which I'm not, that's what they need to do. Positive take-home message is the Amazon is becoming increasingly urbanized. More than half of the people who live in the Amazon now live in a city, all right, and they're part of that service economy. Those people are willing to listen to a message of reform and economic reform that benefits them, that might be linked to a more sustainable use of the natural resources. And so there is it's not all doom and gloom with the Bible, folks, and the gun nuts. Governance, this is where most people talk about corruption. I chose to speak about it in the previous chapter because I don't think corruption is it's not a governance issue. Solution might be found in governance, but I think it's a cultural attribute. All right, there are certain things about the Latin American culture that is, they just accept. I mean, we have corruption here in the United States. I don't want to make it sound like we're not good. We formalize, we legalize our corruption through lobbying and political action committees and stuff like that. But there, it's done informally, like everything's done informally. All right, nobody pays their taxes. You go down, you buy an apple on the corner, nobody pays taxes. You don't pay taxes, they don't pay taxes. Everything's informal. Informality leads you to illegality. All right, and all that's related to inequality because, if you're poor and nobody does anything for you, why should you pay taxes? All right, and so it's all mixed up in there and linked. And so governance is, a lot of people, they've been spending a lot of money. The World Bank and the IMF and the countries themselves have been investing a lot of money in digital systems. If you can get online and register and pay, you don't have to pay the idiot at the office that won't move your paper through the system. And so there are investments that are going on. Decentralization is a big deal. One of the reasons everything's all messed up is because everything's done in the capital city, nothing moves. And so there's a big effort, particularly, Brazil is a federal system anyway, so they're already kind of decentralized by default. But in the Andean countries, these are highly centralized republics, and so they've been investing a lot in decentralization. And as I say, it's a double-edged sword because the mayor is just as likely to steal from the public coffer as the congressman is, or the minister is interested in stealing. So it's necessary. But it's not a risk-free thing. And then there's the forest code, which is very important. I think I'll talk about that later. How does this thing move? Positive take-home message. One thing that's been working very well in Brazil prior to Bolsonaro, and now they're starting it again, are these environmental SWAT teams. And so they're composed of police, usually two kinds of police, federal police, state police, prosecutors, and the Brazilian system has specialized environmental prosecutors that are selected through an autonomous system. The prosecutors are picking their own people. They're not selected by the politicians. And then with the environmental agencies like the Environmental Protected Agency or the indigenous, FUNAI, the indigenous things, and they come together and they create a SWAT team. And they'll go into a place and arrest 10 people for illegal deforestation, or go, like they did recently, up into the Yanomami territories and kicked 40,000 gold miners out of the area. All right? And these are relatively effective because of, they also include tax authorities, and so they have an impact both in the application of the law, but also in the application of media, right? Because this hits the local TV, the local newspaper, it's on Facebook, and so that has a certain amount of impact. The negative, when they do these SWAT teams, they end up finding people, and they have all these remote sensing systems. They know they have, because of the car that land use registry, they know who owns what land. And then they have these, Brazil led the way in remote sensing for deforestation. All right, they were the first to invest in Landsat's processing capacity. They have their own satellites, they have their own software. So they know exactly who's deforesting, where they are, and how much, what percentage of their land is. And so that allows these environmental SWAT teams to come in, or the local prosecutor, and apply fines. All right, well, you're in violation of the forest code. Forest code, they have to leave 80% of their land in forest if they're in the Amazon. You've only got, 40% forest, so you've got a 40% forest debt, that's worth so much, and they apply a fine, and they're significant. Problem is, the state has only managed to collect 5% of the fines that have been levied in the last 20 years. 5% over 20 years. All right, and so don't expect the fines to be effective if you don't collect them. Lula, Rousseff, Temer, and Bolsonaro. Nobody's doing it. And that might be because it's not up to them, it's up to the courts. Biocommerce, this is the forest economy. So I go into this and I describe its traditional components, the wild fishery, logging, it's rubber, Brazil nut collecting, things like that. And just go on. This image is very interesting. That is the Reserva Extractiva Chico Mendes. It's in Acre. It is a Brazil nut place. That, all those little white dots are homesteads, right? And that's, where a family lives, and they work the forest around them for collecting Brazil nuts, and they used to also collect rubber there, but now it's just Brazil nuts. And you can see all that deforestation has happened since it was established as a biological reserve. That's because they can't make a living off of collecting Brazil nuts. And so they cut down a little bit of forest, they grow some grass, and they have a few cows. They're not getting wealthy. They're not like these people here in the colonization zones, which, whack the forest completely. But, it's an indication that the forest economy is not attractive. It's the people who live on it and depend upon it is not working for them. And so they have to cut down a piece of the forest so that they can have some cash income, which they need, because they have to educate their children. They have, medicine. One of the most terrible things that can happen to a poor person is to get sick, and it's terrible. But anyway, that's the. Oh, and the positive message. Acai. How many people have had acai? All right, in the last month, whatever. This is this superfood. It's a palm. It's a Euterpe olorifera, I think it is. And see, I'm still a botanist. I can remember a few names. And ex-botanist. And in the last 10 years, it's gone from $100 million a year to $1 billion a year. So that's exponential growth if you don't recognize the pattern. And it shows that there is a potential of the bioeconomy, the biodiversity of the Amazon, particularly the palms, have great potential, particularly for vegetable oils and edible fruits and things like this. And so that's the positive, a positive story about biocommerce. Chapter 9, this was fun to write because I basically got to write about my own experiences in the 1980s and 90s and into the double aughts. And many of you here have participated in similar type stuff. When the first botanist to go to Bolivia from Missouri was a fellow by the name of Jim Solomon. I don't know if you guys knew that. He was my predecessor. There was a guy in between called David Smith. All right, but Jim Solomon went down there in 1980, stayed till 1989. got the program running. And when he got there, him and Stefan Beck were the only 2 PhDs in the country. Werner Hennegarth, there was another fellow. And that was it. And there was like nobody else. That's why Peter Raven sent Jim to Bolivia. He says, we need to put someone there to help. And so it was slow to start, but Stefan, particularly Stefan, created se hacen escuela. No, he dedicated himself. He didn't publish much. He's not that type of scientist, but he was a tremendous educator, terrific botanist and ecologist, and he probably educated or mentored 100 people in his career, if not more. All of whom mentored 100 people, all of whom mentored 100 people. And now there's literally tens of thousands of biologists in Bolivia. That happened all over the Amazon. Individuals, Al Gendry had dozens of students and disciples. David Neal, I'm talking about the Missouri people that I knew. And it had a big impact. And now you can see these maps that they make based on specimens and modeling specimens. Back in the 80s, there was, we didn't know how to model, and B, there just wasn't any data. All right, and that data has been produced in the country. This is the good story. In country by biologists who are native to that country. And so, and there's universities, there's botanical gardens, there are herbaria, there's biological research stations, none of which existed in 1990. All right, that's only 30 years ago. And maybe a few existed in 1990, but in Brazil, they were better off, but still. It's just been phenomenal growth, and it's created an infrastructure of knowledge that is so much more effective than, this gringo that comes down and says, oh, you need to save that over there because it's an endangered species or for whatever reason, because it comes from within their own societies, and that's particularly valuable. Bad news from the biological inventory is that we've discovered this enormous amount, surprise, of regional variability in species distributions. These maps don't show that. They just show, macro trends. But the deforestation and fragmentation and forest degradation that's occurring in the southern Amazon, mainly in the southern Amazon, but also on the Pia de Monte of the Andes, is leading to inevitably a massive amount of species loss. So that's the negative specimen story, and I'm sure you all are fully aware of that. Chapter 10, this is deforestation, all the high-tech stuff, which I struggle to understand, but I do struggle to understand it. And so I've taken this and tried to put it into language that other people can understand. All right, we've all heard of the tipping point. You've all heard of the tipping point, right? The tipping point. The Amazon's going to go through a step change. Maybe you don't. Maybe you need to read my chapter on this, because there's this hypothesis that's been around for 20 years. Its biggest proponent was Tom Lovejoy and Carlos Nobre, who's a Brazilian climate scientist. And there's a step change, and it occurs when you reach about 80% forest cover, when the transpirational functionality of a forest drops a level. And that's what shifts you into a savanna ecosystem. All right, and it's a step change. And it's between 60 and 80% of forest cover, and it's been demonstrated clearly in the field. I'm having a word problem here. And so the theory is it could manifest itself on the regional scale, or even basic, hopefully not, but on the regular scale. So I go through there and take it apart and explain to these where the feedback loops are, and it's based on physics. It's not based on some crazy theory. It's physics. These are atmospheric scientists. These are physicists and climatologists that are coming up with this information and testing it. And so I go through that and explain that. So it's worth reading for that. And what's the positive news here? The precipitation regimes in the northern Amazon and along the base of the Andes would appear to be stable, just because in the northern Amazon there's no deforestation up there, and the just the intertropical convergence zone functions in a way that those forests are relatively safe. And then on the base of the Andes, you have all that uplifting that goes on. The wind, the rain starts in the Atlantic, goes across the Amazon, it's recycled, and then it hits the Andes, and then there's uplifting, and so you get this kind of orographic impact of rain. There's the orographic shadow, but on the other side of the mountain, you get orographically induced rain. And so the base of the Andes are probably relatively safe. The bad news, that doesn't apply to the southern Amazon. The southern Amazon is screwed. All right, they're already showing 5, 10, 15% reductions in precipitation. The dry season is longer. The temperatures are higher, and so that's not good. So if you're like me and need help understanding this stuff, read that chapter when it comes out. On Indigenous Awakening, this is a chapter, probably I learned more doing this chapter than I had ever learned before. I was a bit arrogant, and I thought we were doing the indigenous people a favor by letting them have some land. No, that's not the way it worked. They did it, all right? They did it. So I started looking at them, and I went from group to group to group to group, and I started discovering, and that's what I write about, is each individual nations or tribes challenges to organize and save their own culture/territory. And each one's different. The Ashaninka, for example, in Peru, they had to fight the Sendero Luminosa. The Ashuan had to deal with, colonists. The Yanomami have to deal with gold diggers. The Kayapo were fighting the mahogany loggers. Each one had to deal with different things. And as they were going through a demographic collapse, and because they almost disappeared between the rubber boom was terrible for them. And then it comes along the 70s, and there's this massive influx of migrants, and they were just like in very bad shape. And they organized themselves. A lot of them got a start with some missionaries, but they pretty soon kicked the missionaries out, took over, organized their own organizations, associated into national organizations, then associated into international organizations, and they did this themselves. All right, this was not an AID project. All right, they did this themselves. It's very impressive, and so there's something to read there. Positive take-home message. Demographics. In 1970, there were only 400,000 ethnic lowland indigenous people. I'm leaving out the indigenous people from the Andes because they're different. Okay, that's a different thing. They're indigenous, but they're not helping us conserve the Amazon, per si acaso. And so today there's more than 2.5 million. So 400,000 to 2.5 million in 50 years. All right, so that's good. All right, that's good news. Unalloyed good news. Bad news is there's a whole bunch of small indigenous people. I think there's 100 groups, 100 tribes, 100 nationalities, 100 language groups that have less than 100 individuals. Those communities have serious challenges in surviving another century or even a few decades. And so they have real challenges, but they're running their own show now, and everybody's in love with them. If you listen to the bingos in Washington, D.C., they all want to give money to the indigenous people, and I think that's fine because otherwise they'd probably waste the money. I'm not biased, though. A conservation report card. So this is the chapter where I look at the evolution, the development, the growth, the success of the protected area systems, as well as the ones that didn't work so well. And let me see, what do we have here? Most of it happened between 1980 and 2000, really 2000, but say 2005. Back in the days of what we call the Washington Consensus. You guys ever heard of the Washington Consensus, Tom? This was Milton Friedman invading South America. All right, this was when the World Bank was imposing market economics on these countries, all of whom, didn't want to do this, but, they didn't have any choice. The Russians had been kicked out, and there was no more communism. And so we had the Washington Consensus, the World Bank, IMF, AID, the Europeans, everybody, you had to have a market-based economy. What also came with that was governance reforms, and one of them is, oh, you want our money to restructure your economy? You need to create a national park system. All right, and so it came, even though the Washington consensus is generally considered to be evil, all right, now, down there, and certainly amongst, intellectual leftist types up here, but it came with this impetus to create national park system and recognize indigenous reserves they were organizing themselves and were there at the same time, but they were not, they did it themselves. I don't want to take anything away from them. And so that's a good news. Really, if you look at the globe, the very best coherently designed, spatially significant protected area system is in the Amazon. Certainly beats ours. Beats anything in England and China, Russia. I don't think so. Africa is it's not there yet. And so that's a success. And we should recognize it as a success. Negative take-home message. There's this thing called REDD, R-E-D-D. You've all heard of that. Not working. It's supposed to be carbon markets, carbon offsets. We'll give you some money. You protect the carbon, and it stays in the forest, and it's just not working. Maybe this year it's supposed to work again. We're on our, I did the first carbon inventory for a REDD project in 1998. All right, with the Nature Conservancy. It was in Noel Kemp Park. We put in 1,500 plots or something like that. It was crazy. And measured the biomass of the park, and the park expanded, created all these carbon credits, which they've never sold. Hasn't generated a dime for anybody. And that's Bolivia's uniquely weird politics. But beyond that, it's just all crazy. And there's all these carbon cowboys. And even if it works, there's just not enough money going through voluntary carbon markets. We're not going to get a compliance carbon market. It's just not going to happen. All right. And so that's not work. Not going to work. Doesn't work. Not going to work, in my humble opinion. Chapter 13, last chapter, and then you can ask questions. In my first publication, in the 2007 version, and typically in this type of publication, at the end you do what's known as an Amazonian, or you do a scenarios analysis where you try to predict the future, and you have a pessimistic scenario, an optimistic scenario, and something in the middle, or two in the middle. And that's nice, it's useful, but I'd done that, didn't want to do it again. Instead, I asked 4 questions and then answered them. All right, and so what will almost certainly happen no matter what we do? Some things are baked in the cake. All right, for example, if there's a road, they will pave it. Guaranteed. If there is a road, they will pave it. And so put on your thinking cap, look at the landscape, where are roads that existing. That also means we have to oppose all new roads. But because if there's a road, they will pave it, and that comes with development, deforestation, cultural change, all kinds of stuff. What might possibly happen, policy, maybe there'll be a carbon market, maybe not. Maybe the forest code in Brazil, maybe the Brazilian state, which is a coherent state. It's not crazy like Bolivia, which is I'm used to, where nothing happens, or Colombia, where there's a civil war going on. Brazil has a coherent federal system and the rule of law. It's Charles de Gaulle made a very deleterious comment once. He says Brazil's not a serious country. But in fact, that was in the 50s, because they like to have parties and do carnival and stuff. That was his view of he made the mistake, go to Rio de Janeiro during carnival, apparently. And so, but Brazil is, in fact, are there any Brazilians here? Am I offending anybody? Okay, good. It is a serious state, and they have real institutions, educational institutions. Their legal system it has a lot of corruption in it, but it's functional, and a lot of honest professionals. And so maybe the forest code, which is this law that's been on the Brazilian books since 1934, it was modified in 1964, and it was modified again in 2008 or 9, right? But it still holds that, if you're in the Amazon, 80% has to be forest cover. And then in the 2009 version, they said, oh, let's change this a little bit. And if you have a forest debt, which means if you're supposed to have 80% and you only have 60%, you have a 20% debt, forest debt, you can put half into some kind of plantation as long as the other half goes into a forest restoration. And so, it's entirely possible that the Brazilians will, or not just the Brazilian, people who buy their stuff. If, you go to Cargill and say, Costco could go to Cargill and say, I'm not going to buy your stuff unless you can demonstrate that your producers are in compliance with the law. We're not asking them to go extra. We're not asking them to solve carbon claim. Be in compliance with the law. And that could change the way agriculture works in Brazil and lead to a reforestation of maybe 20% of the Amazon, of the land that's been lost. Right? And that's just, so that's I can imagine that. I can wrap my head around that. So that's something that might possibly happen. It could also easily happen that Bolsonaro gets reelected and he revokes the forest code and it's open season on the forest. So those are things that might possibly happen. What should never happen, I think we all know what the answer to that is a extreme climate change. The current, according to my buddies in plant physiology, the forest can handle an increase of 1.5 degrees centigrade global. The Amazon can do that. They can do that. Going past 2.5, the physiology of trees starts misfunctioning. All right, and so trees start dying, and there's some evidence that might be happening anyway. But we don't need extreme climate change. And what absolutely must happen, even though I badmouth red and claim it's no good, and the bingos are group thinkers and things like that, I can say that because I know nobody's here is a member of a bingo. Maybe you donate to a bingo, but hey, hopefully a good one. We need revenue transfers, some type of revenue transfer, subsidies, something. Carbon market would work if there was a carbon market, but we need revenue transfer so that impact the producers. I'm not talking about giving a few $100 million to the indigenous people so that they can protect the 25% of the Amazon. The indigenous people of the Amazon control 25% of the surface area for si acaso. That's a significant hunk of land. And they could use carbon markets perhaps to increase their management and protection and stuff. But it's not going to change the behavior of the, 5 or 6 million smallholders who are cutting down the Amazon, cutting down trees to grow, cassava or cows or pigs or sugarcane or whatever because they grow all kinds of stuff. But the highest rate of deforestation in the Amazon is with smallholders, for si acaso. It's not the big guys, it's the small guys. They have the highest rate of deforestation, and they also control 25%, not of the Amazon, but 25% of the previously deforested landscape. And they vote. So somehow or another, we have to figure out how those people can benefit so that they join the conservation team instead of the development team or the conventional development team. And if not, I don't think we have a chance, to be quite honest with you. So that's it. I'm done. Oh, there's one more. I have to do my marketing. So I wrote this massive book that nobody wants to read because it's too long. So I went back to the Moore Foundation and I said, look, okay, now here, see, there's 4 chapters. This is when I had 4 chapters out. It's done. See, I'm doing it. Because they gave me money and then they refused to give me money. They said, no, Tim, you've had enough. You've had your fair share, no more. We don't publish. You're an exception to the rule. We don't fund people who write books. You're charming or something. That they did it. They gave me some money. And but they said no more. But I went back and I said, look, it's a crime. It's not in Spanish and Portuguese. I says, this needs to be in Spanish and Portuguese. And she says, well, Tim, we're not going to give you no more money. But they were looking for a way to support Mongabay, which you guys all know Mongabay, right? Because Peter Raven sends it to your email box every Thursday. All right, and so every day, huh? Okay. And so Since me too, I get copies. And so they said yes. And but they didn't give the money to me. They gave it to Rhett Butler. How many people know Rhett Butler? Not the movie star. The founder of Mongabay, his name is Rhett Butler, and it's spelled exactly the same way. And I don't know why his parents did that to him, but they did. And Mongabay is a bay in Borneo, which is where he grew up. And so he started this newsletter in 1999, and I've known him since then. And he's now, it started out just him. In fact, I remember a conversation in 1999. He was interviewing me about the gas pipeline stuff that we used to do. You know, there was this big Enron gas pipeline in Bolivia that I was involved in. And he was interviewing me about that. And after the interview, I says, Rhett, I says, how do you expect to make a living doing this? No? And he says, I'm going to give it a try. Well, today they publish in, I think, 7 languages. Hindi, Mandarin, German, Spanish, Portuguese, French, English, Tagalog, or whatever the Malaysians speak, Bahasa. And he's got, you know, dozens of correspondents all around the world. So they gave him a pile of money, and not only do I get it translated, all right, he's the same thing in English, you know, and so I'm averaging like, you know, 200 downloads a month off of my White Horse Press a website, which, well, that's what I'm downloading now. Before I started with Mongabay, I was, you know, maybe 100 or 75 downloads per month every time a new chapter came out. We're getting like 50 or 60 reads a month now with Mongabay. And so the message is getting out there in a much more effective way. And I don't have to blog anymore. I was sitting there, I was doing LinkedIn articles and Facebook articles and stuff like this, and I don't do that anymore because, as Avasitas Chinchon says, the person at the Moore Foundation, she says, Tim, you don't know how to do that. And that's certainly the case. Now, I'm done, and you can, if you have any questions, I hope you do. If not, we'll go have a beer or something.